Hero System is one of my favorite role-playing games. It was the first game besides Dungeons & Dragons that I played, and is also the first game I ran as a game master. It's one of the games that people mockingly say, "You need to understand calculus to play that," which just isn't true. Yes, you'll rely on a fair amount of formulae and even some algebra, but calculus is not mandatory. Though they have said in the 5th edition rulebook that the game does rely on a lot of consistent internal logic. So if you start to understand or even become able to explain that logic, then congratulations, you're starting to understand some of the principles of calculus. I titled this video Basics, but this is worth noting. There's a lot to Hero System. The core rulebook for 5th edition is close to 600 pages long, and the rulebook for 6th edition was broken into 2 books. They collectively weigh in at close to 800 pages. These books are huge and dense, almost all of them rules, and there's some good news and bad news to this revelation. The good news is that you don't need to know all of it. Not immediately, at least. The bad news, however, is that this is a game that takes quite a bit of mastery on both the GM and the player's part. Players will likely have trouble creating the characters they envision at first, and GMs might have trouble laying down the rules necessary to really make their games take on the tone and mood they have in mind. With as many options that exist in Hero, it's easy to get overwhelmed or make false steps. Though today, we're going to go over the foundation that makes everything else possible. Characters in Hero System are generally transferable between editions, though it might require a little bit of work. This is because of how open Hero is with character creation. Everything you give to your character costs a certain amount of points. Every attribute, every skill, every power costs a certain amount. And between editions, there may be a few slight changes, but everything remains mostly the same. For example, the way you make a power doesn't change from 5th to 6th edition, but how a specific power works might change. Aid is a good example of this. The effect remains mostly the same. You roll a certain amount of dice and gain that many character points for increasing the given characteristic or power. However, the cost of aid in 5th edition is 10 points for every 1d6, while 6th edition uses the lower cost of 6 points per 1d6. This might amount to needing to remake your character when changing editions, but most of the rulings remain the same, so it's really more checking for what changed. Which the same can't be said about switching between most editions of Dungeons & Dragons. The rulebook I'll be using for this video is 5th edition, but given what I've just discussed, most of this will also carry over into 6th as well. So like I've said in so many other videos, remember to read your rulebook. As mentioned earlier, when you make a character in this game, the GM decides on a certain amount of points you'll be given to make them. The types of games generally fall into 2 categories, heroic and superheroic. Heroic games are more about somewhat believable characters. They're powerful by human standards, but still only human. Heroic games are more like your Marvel characters. They're powerful, but even a common thug can still get the better of them from time to time. Though in a superheroic game, characters are just that. Super. They're frequently performing all manner of deeds that aren't humanly possible, like it's no big deal. These are more in line with your DC heroes. There's a few mechanical differences between heroic and superheroic games, but the most important one is how many starting points you'll be using to make your character. The ranges for what amount of points you'll get differs between editions, but in either edition, they include numerous charts to use as guidelines for building your character. Charts that range from how you should distribute your points, and about what range your various characteristics should be. If you're new to Hero, these guidelines are your friend as both a player and a GM. Everyone around the table should use these if there's somebody that's unfamiliar with the game. There are also numerous different characteristics in Hero System 5th edition, and each one has a different point cost. In 5th edition, you can pretty safely spend your points on only 8 of the characteristics, since many other characteristics are derived from those first 8. These 8 characteristics are Strength, which is your ability to lift and carry, and it influences your character's physical defense characteristic, as well as their unarmed damage. Dexterity, which is hand-eye coordination. This is one of the most powerful stats in 5th edition, since it influences offensive and defensive combat values, as well as speed. Constitution, which is your character's stamina and ability to resist fatigue and illness. It also resists being stunned whenever someone hits you, and it influences the stun and endurance stats, as well as energy defense. Body, which is your character's physical size, as well as their will to live. Body is equivalent to HP from other games, and it also influences stun. Intelligence is your character's logic and reasoning, and affects perception. Ego is your character's ability to focus, remain calm, and otherwise have control over their mental state. This is used for the effectiveness of many mental-based powers. Presence is your character's ability to influence other people. It's not related to what you look like. That would go to comeliness, which is how appealing your character looks. These stats can be used for checks on their own, or they can be used as part of a skill roll. In both such cases, some characteristic will come up more than others, and that's why they cost different amounts. Dexterity factors into a lot of derived attributes, as well as a lot of skills, which is why it costs 3 points for 1 point of dexterity. Comeliness, meanwhile, has almost no uses whatsoever, which is why you get 2 points of comeliness for 1 character point. By the way, these are the derived characteristics. Physical defense, which is your ability to resist cuts and blunt force trauma. Energy defense, which is resisting things like extreme heat and cold. Speed, which is the number of times you're able to act in a combat round. Recovery, which is how quickly your character is able to heal. Endurance, which is how much stamina you have for using powers and beating up people. Stun, which is a secondary sort of HP that determines when you are knocked unconscious. As well as OCV, DCV, and ECV. These are respectively offensive, defensive, and ego combat values. These are used to determine whether or not attacks you make hit or miss. While this is a lot of characteristics, and each has their own cost to raise, the character sheet for 5th edition does a good job of including reminders for how much each of them costs, as well as what influences what. This is the characteristics section of the character sheet for 5th edition. It's somewhat dense, but you can pretty easily infer the import of each characteristic. One of the key differences between 5th and 6th edition, however, is how characteristics are acquired in 6th edition. There's a uniform cost of 1 point per characteristic for every characteristic. So what 5th edition describes as derived characteristics are just ordinary characteristics in 6th edition, leading to the same section in 6th edition looking like this. Meaning you have to buy every single characteristic individually in 6th edition. This gives you a lot more control over what your character is like, but such broad control can lead to very disappointing results, or be just overwhelming if you're new. Hero is a D6 based game, so either dust off your collection for Shadowrun, or raid your old copies of Monopoly. There's 3 recurring rolls you'll be making for Hero system. Attribute rolls, and 2 kinds of damage rolls. Almost everything you use dice for in Hero is some variation of these 3 rolls. The first sort is for attribute, skill, and attack rolls. You roll 3d6s, and you're aiming to roll under a target number. Depending on the situation, there'll be a different way to determine what this target number is. For characteristic rolls, the target number is 9, plus 1/5 of the characteristic in question. Skills vary on a skill-to-skill basis, either by following a similar formula for the related characteristic, or by using an arbitrary number. And for attacks, there's many ways to arrive at the correct number, though the easiest one to remember is 11 plus your offensive combat value minus the target's defensive combat value. As a side note, when I was first learning this game, I had attack rolls explained to me in a much different method. I was told it was the difference between your OCV and the target's DCV added to 11. I had a little trouble remembering that, but when I realized it's mathematically the same as 11 plus the attacker's OCV minus the defender's DCV, the formula I described to you, it suddenly made a lot more sense. This brings up an interesting thing to note about mathematics. The formula for determining your target number for hitting somebody with an attack never changes, but verbally describing it can make it seem different depending on the order you use to describe the operations. While all mathematics can be difficult to initially comprehend, it's important to bear in mind, once you do learn how certain numbers can relate to one another, it doesn't change. 1 plus 1 will always be 2. 2 plus 2 will always be 4. It's why I favor mechanics in games over the settings. The ways to get the number 4 won't change. But a good reason why somebody might fear that number, that can be a much more complicated matter. But I digress. Knowing how to determine if a hit lands isn't quite so useful if you don't know how to determine the damage such a hit does. And, as I mentioned earlier, Hero has two methods, normal damage and killing damage. Normal damage is usually used to determine damage for things that are most likely to knock somebody unconscious. The obvious examples being fists, feet, sticks, and maybe a rock. Say you have an attack that does 66 normal damage. You'll roll all 6 of your dice, and there's 2 pieces of information you're looking for here. First, you're going to add up all the values on the dice. This is how much stun damage the attack does. Do enough of this to a target, and they're out cold, or at least stunned for a little while. Next, you want to count up how much body damage it does. This is done by counting up how many 6s you got, and then doubling that number. Then you add to that how many 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s. This final count is the amount of body damage dealt. Contrast the stun, you do enough body damage, the target dies. As an example, let's say we're shooting an 8d6 energy blast, an ice beam, at an enemy. We've got 6 OCV with the ice beam, and our target has a DCV of 3, the average human DCV. So with 11 plus 6 minus 3, we need a 14 to hit our target. We roll 3, 2, and 5, giving us a total of 10. We hit. Next, we roll our 8 dice to determine damage, coming up with 6, 3, 1, 5, 6, 4, 2, and 1. With all that, we score 8 body and 28 stun. Incidentally, the average human in Hero System has 10 body and 20 stun, and a physical and energy defense rating of 2. They would reduce both the body and stun damage by their energy defense of 2, since this is an ice beam. So after applying defense to the damage, 8 minus 2 is 6, and 28 minus 2 is 26. 6 isn't enough body damage to kill the target, they'll still have 4 left. The 26 stun damage, however, is definitely enough to knock them unconscious by reducing their stun below 0. They're out cold, and when they wake up, they're gonna be in pain. Killing damage is exactly that. Damage meant to kill, destroy, and end lives. It does have potential to knock out targets, but it's more likely to do what its namesake implies. Say you've got a 2d6 killing damage attack. You roll both, then add up the total value shown. That's the amount of body damage the attack deals. After you've determined your body damage, you roll yet another d6 and subtract 1 from that number. This number is then multiplied by the amount of body damage dealt and yields the stun damage for this attack. Killing damage can potentially do a lot of stun, thus it's able to be used to knock somebody unconscious. However, 1d6 minus 1 can result in 0, and since any number multiplied by 0 equals 0, it's possible you'll wind up doing no stun damage. Let's have another example, with a similar situation. We're using a 2d6 ranged killing attack. That, we'll say, is an assault rifle. But we instead have an OCV of 4 to the defender's 6 DCV. This makes our target number calculation 11 plus 4 minus 6 for 9. We roll 1, 6, and 2, which meets our target number, just barely letting us hit. Next, we roll damage, giving us a 5 and a 6. These two are added together to give us the body damage. To determine the stun, we roll 1d6 and subtract 1. Our dice comes up 1, which is subtracted by 1 to give us 0, and the attack does no stun damage. Also, since this is a killing attack, only resistant type defenses reduce it, which is only able to be acquired through powers. Let's assume our target doesn't have any resistant defense, so they're taking that full 11 damage. That's enough to leave an ordinary human on the ground bleeding out, since it reduces their body below 0. Regardless of which sort of damage is dealt, you'd apply defense to the damage, which works as one might expect. Defense reduces the amount of damage taken. Each point of defense negates 1 point of body and stun. There's a few nuances to defense as it applies to damage though. For starters, defense can be classified as normal, which only guards against normal damage, or resistant, which guards against normal and killing damage. This means killing damage is more powerful not just because one dice of it will typically do more damage, but it's also harder to negate. In addition, damage is further classified as physical or energy. Physical being stabs, bludgeons, cuts, and other similar sources, whereas energy could be fire, electricity, extreme cold, or even magic. If it wasn't obvious from the game's extensive rulebook, Hero is a very dense game. A bulk of these rules are used during character creation, specifically for the creation of powers. Powers are one of the pillars of Hero's system. Almost everything from simple energy blasts to magic swords or even nuclear bombs can be built in Hero's system, and expressed as a power. Building a power in Hero is relatively straightforward. You decide on the basic effect of the power and how strong you want it to be. You start with something like an energy blast that does 10d6 normal damage. Then decide on its effects that make it more or less effective, called advantages and limitations. An advantage would be something like making the energy blast capable of piercing through armor, while a limitation would be that using the energy blast costs more endurance than it normally would. Creating a power is also where the so-called advanced mathematics of Hero's system comes in. The basic effect grants you a basic cost of the power. Each advantage you apply raises the cost of the power by a certain amount using the following formula. 1 plus the value of the advantages times the base cost. The result of this formula is called the active cost, and it's a measure of how strong the power really is. Most often, there's a limit on how high the active cost of a power can be. Then, your limitations on the power lower the active cost using this formula. Active cost divided by 1 plus the value of limitations. The result of this formula is the real cost, which is how many character points you have to spend to acquire this power. And just as a nice touch, Hero System 5th Edition includes a quick reference table, just in case you don't have a calculator handy. If the formula are a bit much for you to take in right now, just remember this. You start with the base cost, advantages raise the base cost to the active cost, and limitations lower the active cost to the real cost. And then you just refer to the formula later as you need them, and plug the numbers in. That's the theory behind power creation. In practice though, you'll probably spend more time reading different effects of powers, advantages, and limitations to decide on the right one for what you have in mind. The 5th edition revised rulebook weighs in at about 600 pages, with about 100 of these pages being dedicated to data on building powers. This is probably the most important thing to initially familiarize yourself with, since it's an important part of creating a character. Everything else though, that's mostly rules for specific situations. Before we wrap up, let's build a power real quick as an example. Let's make an ice blast that's hard to guard against. We start by determining the base effect of the power. We'll pick a 10d6 energy blast. Energy blast has a base cost of 5 points per 1d6 of damage, making 10d6 have a base cost of 50 points. Next, we need to determine what advantages we want the blast to have. Armor piercing is what we'll go with, since that makes the defender only use half their defense against the attack. Armor piercing is a half-point cost advantage. So by putting that into our formula, we have 1 plus half a point times 50 for 75. This means that our active cost for this power is now 75. That is a bit steep for my liking, so let's pick a limitation for this power. Let's go with 2 of them actually. Gestures and incantations. Gestures means that our character's hands need to be free in order to use this ability, and incantations mean they're obviously speaking while they're using it. Gestures has a limitation value of 1/4 or 1/2 if we go with both hands, and incantations has a value of 1/4 as well. Let's go with both hands required to get the maximum effect out of this power. So to put this into our formula, we have 75 divided by 1 plus half plus 1/4 for 42.8, and a bunch of other decimal places that will just round down to 42. The real cost, how many points we have to pay to get this power, is 42. Ultimately a little bit less costly than if we were to go with a straight 10d6 energy blast. Altogether, this means our character is able to shoot an icy beam that is so cold, armor isn't as effective against it, but they need to have their hands free and the ability to speak. Sounds a bit like something a wizard would do, doesn't it? That's the basics of Hero System. You don't need to read the book from cover to cover, but you'll definitely need to spend a little bit of time familiarizing yourself with it. Because you'll eventually need to spend a fair amount of time reading over specific sections, either to gain an understanding of a particular power, or to refresh your memory on how something works. If you're starting out entirely new, or you have players that will be new to the game, consider using some of the source books. Hero System has its roots in being a superhero game, and for that reason, the Champions 5th Edition book is one of the most effective splat books for Hero System 5th Edition. Specifically, it gives a list of pre-made power sets and attributes for characters to use that'll put them on fairly even footing with one another. Because one of the most common problems I've noticed in any Hero System game I've played is this. There will always be one or two characters that either completely outshine everybody, or there'll be one or two that completely fall behind. And Champions has some write-ups that take some of the challenge out of balancing players against one another out of the equation, making it more like, say, Dungeons & Dragons, where you pick a few options from a list, and that's your character. You'll still need to refer to the Hero System core book to understand what your character's powers can do and how to use them, but there's nothing Champions gives that's inherently useless. Though, if superheroes are not your thing, Fantasy Hero is another good choice, doing much of the same thing as Champions, and being very similar to how character creation worked in the Dark Eye 5th Edition. And of course, if you're a GM, to save yourself time, you'll definitely want one of the books that have pre-made villains or creatures, such as Conquerors, Killers, and Crooks for Champions, or the generic and much more simply named Hero Bestiary. Make no mistake though, Hero System is heavy and can be a real challenge to get a grip on. If you're a cautious sort who wants to dip your toes in a little bit before going nuts with a 600-page behemoth, try Hero System's Sidekick first. It's a much lighter version of 5th edition that uses a stripped-down set of the rules that are still compatible with the full version. So if you're using Hero System Sidekick and feel that a particular rule in there could stand to be a little bit more robust, you can easily integrate it with its 5th edition counterpart. But make no mistake, the full version of Hero System is not for the faint of heart. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, give me a thumbs up like. And if you want to learn more about more complex or even simpler games, feel free to subscribe. And finally, if you've got any questions about Hero System, feel free to leave them in the comments. Hero System may be dense, but remember, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step.